So, first of all, before I begin my remarks, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting here on the land of the three fires, the Anishinaabe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And I live and work, I have the privilege of living and working on the Coast and Strait Salish traditional territory. And that's this area, this end of Vancouver Island. As you can see from the larger map, Vancouver Island is just off the west coast. Has anybody ever been to Victoria or to Vancouver Island? Great. It's just close to Seattle. It has the same kind of climate as Seattle. And whenever we do more formal kinds of presentations, we always acknowledge the territory, and when we travel to other places, we always acknowledge the territory of those places where we are going to, and that's the reason why I've said what I've said. I'm a settler Canadian of English heritage, and my great-grandparents settled right here in Chemainus in 1871. They were people from Staffordshire, poor people from Staffordshire, who were obviously looking for a better life, and they ended up in eastern Canada, in Ottawa. And they had some kind of rocky land that they made into a farm. But then in the late 1860s, they saw an advertisement in a newspaper in Ottawa, a double spread newspaper, and it was a beautiful drawing of a tall forest, and then a small white, very English style cottage with a white picket fence around it. And the top of the page said white, or said English farm families wanted. They thought, wow, where am I going to get a chance like that? So they got on a train, went to New York. They got on a boat and went to Panama. There's no Panama Canal yet. They took a train across the Isthmus of Panama. They took another boat up to San Francisco, another boat from San Francisco to Victoria, and then they took another boat around from Victoria to we call Maple Bay. And they got 200 acres of land. Now the land that they got was the traditional, and is the traditional territory of the Halalt, H-A-L-A-L-T, Halalt First Nations. And the community center for the Halalt First Nations is still right there, and the 200 acres that was my family farm is still right there north of Duncan. How did they get that land? Dunsmuir was a Scottish businessman who had moved to Victoria in the early days of Victoria. He had experience in construction. There was coal in Nanaimo, up the island, but they had no way to get the coal to the port, to Victoria. So they asked Dunsmuir if he would build a railroad. And of course, for a fee, he said, of course, he'd be happy to do that. But he said, you've got to give me quite a lot of land on either side of the railroad, otherwise it's not worth my while. So, they said, sure, no problem. So they gave him, notice we use the word gave, they gave him land of the Halalt, in the case of my grandparents, of the Halalt First Nations. And that land was then flipped by a property developer based in Seattle And the property developer in Seattle was the person who did the advertising and sent the adverts to the newspaper in Ottawa in order to recruit. Now the deal was the land would cost $5 an acre. The land they bought the land for $1 an acre, and because they were a family, they were able to buy 200 acres of, I mean, really beautiful soil. If you come up, if you've been in on the island, it's just gorgeous soil. So they got 200 acres, and there was a little asterisk in the purchase saying, but once a title has been, the treaty has been agreed upon with the Hulkameelan people, you'll have to pay an extra $4 an acre. By that time it was 1869, and this is, what is this, 2016, I guess, aren't we? And there's never been a treaty with the Hulkameelan people. And the Hulkameelan elders meet every day at a coffee shop, every Tuesday at a coffee shop in Duncan, British Columbia, as the Hulkameelan Treaty Working Group. They've been meeting that way for 50 or 60 years, and there's still no treaty. So I benefited. The acquisition of this land benefited my family. That transformed them from, kind of landless wanderers to middle-class Canadians. And the children of my great-grandparents all went to university. And I am actually standing here today in front of you on the land here of the Three Fires because of the benefit that I received from that land being transferred. And the generation of my age and the Halal community from that point on have lived a life of poverty. And if you go to the community at Halal, you'll see the kind of struggle that they're still facing. They're still there. They're still fighting for their rights, but all of the land, except for a very small part, which they were given back to, has been taken away. I mention this because in the talk about epistemicide, and I'll tell you a bit more about that word, kind of an interesting word. In a talk about decolonization, I wanted to start, from where I am. Because I think that when we start to think about decolonization, I think it's important for us to start where we are, to dig where we stand, to find out. I wanted to find out how in the world did my family get that land? What was the process? What was the legal, illegal, how was it done? And I've been able to trace that. And I've been able to acknowledge that. And I've been able to acknowledge the benefit that our family received to the Halal community itself. I've been there and I've had meetings and so forth. Because colonization is something that, as settler peoples, we all have a connection to, either historically or in the contemporary sense. So when we start to get into a conversation around, a bigger, almost philosophical kind of thing around decolonization of knowledge, or the decolonization of something as huge as a higher education institution, I think it's important to start where we are. Now, the other thing I want to do is that nothing that I am saying to you today is anything that I've really invented or created all by myself. Whatever I am saying to you today is a product of a number of years of conversations, with people in different parts of the world. Indigenous people, non-indigenous people, people from Africa, people from all over the place. And so here are some of the names. And I even have one of the names at the very bottom. You see the word Ayo-Ndem. See that at the bottom there? Ayo-Ndem. And when I was a student here at Michigan State University, I was one of the first exchange students to the University of Nigeria in 1964. And Ayo-Ndem was the Nigerian professor of anthropology that I had. And his perspective on, on there being an African way, an Afrocentric way of seeing the world really destabilized my thinking, to say the least. And it started me on a journey which, I'm still on. Now, another thing that's important to know about our situation in Canada is that we've just in this last year, there's been a release. We've been going through for the last number of years a truth and reconciliation process. And the truth and reconciliation process has been a public process across the country where we have, and the report is now, there's a finalized report. You can find it online. It's an absolutely riveting, document. It's a long document. It's a fascinating document. But in it, we have recognized as Canadian people that we have participated in physical, biological, and cultural genocide with regard to our Aboriginal peoples. Indigenous peoples in Canada were denied the right to use their own names. If you look at a lot of the names, you find Scottish names and English names and all kinds of names. Those have nothing to do with who they were originally called. They've been denied the right to hold traditional marriage ceremonies. They've been denied the right to practice spiritual traditions. They've been denied the right to vote, and a lot of other things. They've been basically, the attempt at cultural genocide has been steady and relentless. And now, having come through this process of reconciliation, we are in a time when we are called upon, non-Indigenous people, settler people, are called upon through the generosity of the Indigenous peoples of Canada to enter into a period of reconciliation. This is one of the most generous acts, that I know of. Here are a people who, for 500 years, have been systematically, oppressed, killed off, culturally relegated, ignored, every kind of disrespect that you can think of. And yet, in spite of all of that, the Indigenous people of Canada you could even call it a resurgence. There's probably as many Indigenous people now as there were at the time of colonial contact, European contact, and they are thriving, in educational and cultural, political, and in many, many ways. There's a lot of work to be done, and the outcome isn't clear. Whether or not the non-Indigenous population, of which I am one, whether we will collectively be able to respond to the generosity that's been offered us, it's hard to tell. I'm optimistic. I think that the future of Canada, a Canada that will be, have a real Canadian identity, not just a kind of a, Euro-American, God knows what sort of identity, but a real Canadian identity depends on our ability to transform ourselves through this reconciliation process. I share this information with you because I hope that not in any kind of boastful way, but in a very humble way, and I'm sharing this with you as an ally, as a non-Indigenous ally, who is working my way towards trying to understand and trying to act in support of the decolonization of knowledge and the decolonization of our universities. And so in a way, I hope that you'll not take offense, and hope you will see what I'm doing as is intended, as one way to move through this labyrinth of ideas and ways of knowing. So some intellectuals, academics have got to have slides with some intellectuals. Chief Luther Standing Bear, knowledge was inherent in all things. The world was a library. I love that concept. The Treaty of Lancaster, a very old treaty, I think it's in the Virginia colony, and Canasatego says, "You who are so wise," he's speaking to the colonizers, "you who are so wise must know that different nations have different conceptions of things. You will not therefore take it amiss if our ideas of the white man's education happens not to be the same as yours." The president of the International Association of Universities is a very interesting fellow. He's from Malaysia. And he says, he asks us, and he says, is there any value to Asian and African education if it is conceptualized and presented in the context of what happened in that very provincial place called Western Europe and then imposed upon us? And here's somebody who some of you heard last week, Rajesh Tandon. He says, unless we value local knowledge, there will be no new knowledge. And here's a quote from a fellow you're going to hear from, Sean Wilson, coming up. He's the next in the series. An indigenous paradigm comes from the fundamental belief that knowledge is relational, knowledge is shared with all creation. Boaventura de Sousa Santos is the fellow who says, the understanding of the world by far exceeds the Western understanding of the world. Interesting, huh? The understanding of the world by far exceeds the Western understanding of the world. There can be no global social justice without global cognitive justice. The geographer David Harvey has elaborated on the concept of accumulation through dispossession in order to explain how capital, the basis of our dominant economic system, began to be accumulated. Dispossessing people of access to their land, he suggests, lies at the heart of early capital accumulation. The story of my family's transformation through the dispossession of the lands of the Halalt First Nations on my island is a perfect example. Harvey draws attention to the processes in the 14th and 16th century in England, which removed people from their land through what has become known as the enclosures. He tells us of wealthy landowners who used force and even arms to transform the traditional open fields and communal pastures into private property for their own profit. A similar process similarly affected the clans of Scotland, which was so widespread that their dispossessions became known as the clearances. Each of these acts of dispossession left the majority of people without access to land and allowed for wealth to accumulate to those who were now known as private landowners. New categories of people were defined: landed gentry, the workers in the estates of the land, and the landless. But what does this have to do with higher education and knowledge? I had the opportunity a few years ago to spend some time at this particular college at Oxford University. And I discovered that this university was created at the same time as the enclosures. So you have on one hand people accumulating land, putting up barriers, and declaring themselves as private landowners. And on the educational side, you had the creation of medieval universities, Oxford and Cambridge being two in that area, that part of England. And what were they doing?